As Captain Edmund Blackadder once facetiously said, in 1914 the German Empire consisted chiefly of one small sausage factory in Tanganyika. There was also an important naval base on the east coast of China at Tsingtao, where the German East Asia Squadron was based. It was also obvious to the Germans that once hostilities had commenced, there would be no way of resupplying Tsingtao with manpower or ammunition or anything else. So the German commander, Admiral von Spee, decided to head off to the south of America and make a nuisance of himself, where he fought the Battle of Coronel, sending Admiral Christopher Craddock to the bottom of the ocean, before finally running out of luck at the Battle of the Falklands, where the Royal Navy caught up with him. Meanwhile, back in Tsingtao, one ship had stayed behind. Captain Karl von Muller had suggested that his ship, the cruiser SMS Emden, which was much faster than all the others, would do far better if it stayed in the Indian Ocean and just cruised around causing trouble and mayhem and basically acting like a modern-day pirate. And that's just what he set out to do. Accompanied by a cargo ship full of coal, they set off, and over the next few months, they sunk 17 Allied ships, and sending their cargoes to the bottom, or if they had useful supplies and food and coal on board, they would simply take it in order to help them continue their cruise. They headed down to Madras on the Indian coast and destroyed the oil storage tanks, and then headed down to Penang in Malaya in October, where they got right inside the harbour, sinking a Russian cruiser and a French destroyer, causing utter chaos in the process. By this time, Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, was getting a bit fed up with hearing the name Emden, and issued an order just saying, for goodness sake, just get out there and sink it. So every Allied ship in the area starts combing every part of the ocean to try and find it and sink the Emden before it does any more damage. The German crew decided that in order to try and disguise themselves, they built an extra funnel, so that instead of looking like a German cruiser with 3 funnels, it looked like an Allied one with 4. And so as it passed the Dutch East Indies, it was less likely to be spotted and reported as the Emden. Their luck finally ran out in early November. Von Muller decided to head down to the Cocos Islands and set about the wireless station. He thought he'd disrupt Allied communications. But unluckily for the Emden, the crew of the wireless station spotted them as the landing party was heading for the shore. And they sent a message saying, "Emden here, come quickly." The message was picked up by an Australian troop convoy, which was heading up towards Egypt and later on to Gallipoli. And the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney was detached to go and head off to the Cocos Islands and deal with the Emden. And the Emden spotted her when it was too late, because the Sydney was coming fast. The Emden was pretty much sat there without much steam up. And by the time they were in a position to do anything about it, the Sydney were pretty much on top of them. The Sydney also had a greater range, so it was able to shell the Emden from a greater distance. And during the duration of the battle, the Emden managed to land about 16 hits on the Sydney, killing 3 of the Sydney's crew, whereas over 100 shells rained into the Emden from the Sydney, killing at least 133 of the crew. It really did a lot of damage. It was absolutely pummeled. Eventually, von Muller ran the ship ashore, but even then, the colours were still flying. They've still got the battle ensign up, and until you strike your colours, you're a fair target. So the Sydney just kept battering away until eventually German sailors ran 2 white flags up in surrender. The fighting was over. The crew were captured the following day, all except for that landing party, who managed to get themselves on a schooner, the Aisha, and head off on an amazing adventure which saw them actually making it all the way back to Germany. But that's another story. The Sydney, having done what it needed to do, heads back off, joins the convoy again, heading up towards Egypt. A couple of days later, the Australian government, realising that this is the first proper Australian action of the war, says, but we need some souvenirs. We have to have something. This is important. We need to have some trophies. And the Admiralty, who had got their hands full doing other things, said, okay, well, we'll send somebody to sort that out. And they sent a sloop called HMS Cadmus from Malaya. I think she's in Singapore Harbour. And the Cadmus trots over to the Cocos Islands, and the crew of the Cadmus dismantled guns and took all sorts of bits and pieces. And one of the crew members was a fella who came from Ipswich. And amongst the bits and pieces that were packed away for the Australian government, he managed to secure himself a few souvenirs of his own. In fact, originally, according to his notes, There was the original cat o' nine tails that the Emden had. There was some of the books from the library of von Leuterbach, who was the prize officer on board. There was an original crossing the line certificate for when they crossed the equator. All sorts of fascinating bits and pieces. But one thing is this shell case from a German 105mm shell, which was made at Karlsruhe in 1897, and it has a shield on the front engraved "Relic from SMS Emden after action with HMAS Sydney, November the 9th, 1914, with this wonderful Chinese dragon design, which I suspect he got somebody to engrave for him. But a fantastic souvenir, because to be honest, in a naval action, particularly the Emden, who was never going to be able to get any more resupply, after action, in the normal run of things, empty brass cases would just have been lobbed over the side. They wouldn't have been kept. So this must have been one of the shells which was fired actually on that day, on the 9th of November, without any doubt at all. One of the other things that he kept was one of these. Now, the Emden had a whole load of Mexican silver dollars on board for incidental expenses, which were kept in the safe, the majority of which went back to Australia. The Australian government actually turned some of them into special little souvenirs with a little plaque on the top. But this particular one, which he's had engraved, SMS Emden, 9th of the 11th, 14, shows quite clearly that they didn't all make their way back to the Australian government. In addition, from a separate source, this came from Germany. This came from a German businessman who had it since the 1950s. And it's a section of the speaking tube from the bridge to the engine room of the Emden, made of brass or copper, very, very crudely cut apart with an engineering saw. The Emden was cut up in the 1950s for scrap, so it may well have been then. But what's fascinating about it, it's just the violence. It's the sheer violence that's torn the thing to shreds. The way that the copper has just been shredded by these incredibly large chunks of metal flying through it. You really do get a sense of just what a terrifying experience it must have been to be a stationary target stuck on the shore with just tons and tons of these massive shells raining down on top of you, until finally they were able to run the white flags up and surrender. The story of Emden is extraordinary. In fact, in the 1920s, the German government announced that everybody who was a survivor, all the crew who'd survived it, were allowed to add the name Emden after their own surname. And a bit later than that, I think in the early 1930s, von Hindenburg said that actually the families of those who were killed could do the same. So like Leuterbach, who was the prize officer, he became Julius Leuterbach Emden, which was quite an honour. And there were two other ships named Emden afterwards. It really is one of those fascinating stories of the First World War, which bear no relation whatsoever to what you would normally expect to hear.